Hello everyone, this is Bob Harkins, creator and host of Raised Sports. I want to take a moment to talk to you about podcast reviews and ratings. Now, a lot of podcasts ask their listeners to write reviews for them on Apple Podcasts. It's supposed to really help with exposure, but how many podcasts offer a reward for doing so? Well, we are doing just that, for this month only. If you go over to our page on Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star rating and a brief review, but one thing, before you submit it, take a screenshot and email it to us at raisedsports@gmail.com. Everybody who does this will have their name thrown in a hat, and at the end of the month we'll draw one and send the winner a Raised Sports t-shirt featuring the handmade design created by our friends at Coolfire Studios. We know you can do this. It's so easy. It takes literally 30 seconds. So go to our page on Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star rating and review, email us the screenshot, and be entered to win a t-shirt. Thank you so much for taking part. Now on with the show.
If I had an idea and if I had something that I believed in and that I could prove, go for it, do it. They just wouldn't have the ability to support me. They wanted me to see if there was others out there that wanted to team up with me. And that became a hard sell. You'd get a lot of cold calls and, hello, I'm so-and-so, I'm going to take on the National Football League. Are you interested? Good luck with that. But eventually I found some people that were interested.
For decades now, football has been America's favorite sport. We love its athleticism, its speed, its grace, and if we're being honest, we also love its violence and its brutality.
He hasn't moved since he took that hit.
The players are modern-day gladiators, sacrificing their bodies for every yard of Coliseum turf.
Once again, a violent collision. This one's head-to-head.
They get dinged up, they get their bells rung, and then they shake it off and get back out there, all for our entertainment.
Are you not entertained?
But it is becoming increasingly apparent that there is a price to be paid for this entertainment. Long-term effects that can dramatically impact the lives of both the athletes and their loved ones.
People need to know that the human brain is a post-mitotic organ. It doesn't have any reasonable capacity to cure itself of injuries.
Welcome to Season 1 of the Raised Sports Podcast, in which we'll tackle the issue of concussions and CTE, brain trauma in the sport of football.
He took a vicious hit. He's still down, hasn't moved.
What does it all mean for the health of the athletes, these modern-day gladiators?
I don't know how you take this out of the game of football. I don't know if there's anything you can do.
And how will our growing knowledge of the issue impact the future of the sport itself? In the long run, is it all worth it?
Atwater just killed Randy Hilliard.
Episode 7. I'm going to take on the National Football League. In December of 2016, the Supreme Court rejected challenges to the settlement of a landmark lawsuit against the National Football League. That cleared the last hurdle to a $1 billion agreement. Former players would finally be compensated for brain ailments they suffered playing professional football. The agreement, now commonly referred to as the NFL concussion litigation, changed the sport forever, and even though the NFL admitted no fault as part of the deal, it brought a new level of awareness to the dangers of the sport. But while this lawsuit and settlement rocked the sports world, the way it all started was almost unbelievable. It involved an unlikely friendship between two men from vastly different backgrounds, a chance conversation, and a determined young lawyer who refused to give up. That lawyer was Jason Luckasevic, and this is his story. Picture two men sitting in an office back in 2006. One is a forensic pathologist from Nigeria. He's small in stature, but he's whip-smart, confident, almost brash. The other man is a calm-voiced lawyer and a native of Pittsburgh's Mon Valley, part of a western Pennsylvania football hotbed that produced legends like Mike Ditka, Tony Dorsett, Dan Marino, and Joe Montana. The first man, until recently at least, knew virtually nothing about football. The second grew up worshiping his beloved Steelers, as well as the Penguins of the National Hockey League. The first man in this scene is Dr. Bennet Omalu, who in 2002 had put the NFL on notice when he discovered chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, in the brain of former Steelers lineman Mike Webster. The second man is Luckasevic. They'd become friends through Jason's brother Todd, a forensic pathologist himself who had worked with Omalu. Omalu and Jason had begun working together on asbestos cases, a specialty of Jason's firm, Goldberg, Persky, and White. So they're having this meeting, and the conversation takes a turn that would end up changing everything. Here's Jason Luckasevic.
We had this conversation in my office. I remember one day he was there going over some other materials that he and I were working on together on a case he was helping me out with, because we got to know each other pretty well and trusted each other, and enjoyed working with each other on various legal, medical issues. And that's when he said, "Yeah, you don't know half the story. They're really coming after me hard. They don't like this. They don't want this. They're trying to ruin me and end my career."
The they Omalu was referring to was the NFL, and the league was growing increasingly unhappy with him as he continued to find CTE in the brains of former players. By this time, Andre Waters, Terry Long, and Justin Strelzik had joined Webster as known victims of the disease, thanks to Omalu's work.
And I said, "Well, do something about it. Look into it. Figure it out. Fight back." And he said, "Well, you're a good lawyer. You figure it out." And I said, "Well, Bennett, the problem is I don't really have clients in this world, and I don't really have time. I'm a young lawyer right now. I got enough on my plate, and I'm doing just fine doing what I'm doing. Keeping me busy. It's obviously keeping you a little bit busy." And he said, "Well, that's not a problem. You look into it, and people will call you."
Eventually they would call, but it was a long road ahead for Jason. Jason Luckasevic grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood. His father worked in a glass factory, and he had other relatives who worked there or in the steel industry as well. The community was all about the Steelers in those days, and they rallied around that team every Sunday, right after church. And whenever he and his brother went out to play, imitating their favorite Steelers or Penguins stars, their parents would warn them, "Be careful and watch your heads." So, as he's sitting there in his office with Dr. Omalu, Jason sensed that his friend was right about the link between CTE and football. He says it was common sense. He knew that boxers could end up beat up and punch-drunk by the time they were done, and he says it wasn't a big leap to see a potential problem for football as well. He also was troubled by articles he was seeing in the paper, articles questioning Omalu's character and the science behind his work, calling his findings speculative. He trusted the work of his friend, and he wanted to support him, so he started digging.
I wanted to see if there was support in the science. I talked to some of the great experts out there besides Dr. Omalu, Dr. Cantu, and Dr. Amon, and so many others who were out there and understood this, to ask them, is this real? Is what Bennett's seeing real? Is this a problem? Is this scientifically there? Is this a brain injury? Is it caused from trauma? Is it caused from playing this game? And they all confirmed it. And I would take the next step from there and look at all the publishings, see the history of publications. And I came across one of my favorites pretty early on, which was a 1954 publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, which was always the most authoritative publication in our entire country. And there was a publication saying, if any football player had 3 concussions, he needed to retire or stop playing the game of football. And this was in 1954. And then you went back and you found all the old publishings from Dr. Martland and about finding CT, or what he used to call punch drunk, in boxers going back to the 20s. From there, it was just looking at all the science and the science building from the 20s all the way on up until the 60s and 70s, when the Lancet, which was the major publication in England, was publishing about brain injury being a cumulative injury occurring from multiple hits, and being very debilitating to people for multiple traumas. Up until the 80s, when Cantu was publishing on return to play guidelines and telling organizations and leagues out there that, hey, by the way, there's these different grades of concussions, there's these different grades of hits, and if a player has them, you need to sit them, you need to monitor them, you need to take care of them.
But then Jason noticed something that really alarmed him. The NFL's Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, which was made up primarily of doctors with connections to teams, was using its clout to try to control the narrative via their own contradictory league-funded research, and in doing so, undercut Dr. Omalu's work.
It was the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee that was created by the NFL that was designed to manipulate the science and state that not only was these players' trauma okay for them, that they weren't, they should not be kept back from playing any games if they have a concussion. In fact, they should go back and play the very next game. They weren't having later life problems. That maybe that, if anything, it was just some changes in the helmet that could be made or whatever. So I saw that as a blatant effort to manipulate science, especially when they came out and tried to retract and refute the findings of Dr. Omalu.
Through all his research, Jason was satisfied that the science was sound, but he still didn't know if there was an actual legal application to all of this. He noted that Bob Fitzsimmons, a lawyer from West Virginia, had sued and won a disability claim on behalf of the Mike Webster family. But Jason wasn't a workers' comp guy, and he viewed this as something much bigger than a series of individual disability claims. But could you bring a large suit against the NFL when all of the rules were collectively bargained between the owners and the players' union? Jason wasn't sure, but then he found two cases in particular that gave him hope. One was the case of Corey Stringer, a Minnesota Vikings offensive lineman who died of complications from heat stroke during training camp in 2001. He was only 27. A wrongful death lawsuit brought by Stringer's widow was settled in 2009. The other case that caught Jason's attention was that of Orlando Brown, an offensive lineman who was injured when a penalty flag weighted with ball bearings was accidentally thrown into his eye by a referee in 1999. Brown missed 3 seasons due to temporary blindness. He sued the NFL for $200 million in damages in 2001 and would ultimately settle for somewhere between $15 to $25 million.
And I saw, yes, in fact, you can sue the NFL because they have a duty that extends outside of the collective bargaining agreement. So from there, it was putting pencil to paper or fingers to keyboard to put together a complaint and figure out who was on my team, so to speak, and believed in it and believed in me. And that was a challenge in and of itself. It showed you that justice isn't what you think it is in law school. It's who's willing to take on a fight and who has who's bold enough and willing to take a risk and throw money at something like this. So that was quite a challenge as well.
Hello friends, Bob Harkins taking a moment to tell you once again about our friends at Cool Fire Studios, a wonderful graphic design, printing, and art studio. Now whether you need a t-shirt, business cards, whatever, anything to make a splash, Cool Fire Studios artists can make something unique just for you. We're not talking about logos on shirts. They can do that for you too, but what really separates Cool Fire is that they do unique artwork, which can set you apart from everybody else. For an example of this, just look at our official Raised Sports t-shirt over on their website. So check out Cool Fire Studios. That's cool with a K. coolfirestudios.com. Jason had confirmed that Dr. Omalu's work had been sound, and that there was an extensive amount of science behind it. He had also found that there was legal precedent to pursue a lawsuit against the NFL. But the tough work was just beginning. For one thing, Jason needed help. His firm, Goldberg, Persky & White, was already well established and not in need of or seeking a whole new field of work. And as a 30-year-old associate at the time, Jason didn't have a whole lot of authority. When he presented his pitch to partners, they basically laughed at him. Here's a little passage from the excellent book League of Denial by Mark Fanuro-Wada and Steve Fanuro that lays it out perfectly. Quote, "It wasn't that Goldberg, Persky, and White was afraid of the NFL. The firm had helped pioneer asbestos litigation in the Rust Belt. But beyond the partners' howling skepticism about the potential for a lawsuit, the case probably would require a huge number of man-hours. It wasn't a case that one lawyer, or even necessarily one firm, could take on," end quote. The partners declined to get involved, but they did give Jason their blessing to pursue it on his own, as long as it didn't interfere with his regular duties.
They supported me as a professional. If I had an idea and if I had something that I believed in and that I could prove, go for it, do it. They just wouldn't have the ability to support me. They wanted me to see if there was others out there that wanted to team up with me. And that became a hard sell. You'd get a lot of cold calls and, "Hello, I'm so-and-so. I'm going to take on the National Football League. Are you interested? Good luck with that," kind of responses. But eventually I found some people that were interested.
The other big hurdle, though, was finding clients. Bennet had told Jason that people would call, but it wasn't so easy as to just make an announcement, "Hey, I'm going to sue the NFL. Who wants in?"
Players were very reluctant. They were unsure. They didn't trust anybody. They've been screwed a million times over, from agents to owners to coaches to getting cut to this, that. It was a business that here today, gone today. And so it was very hard to gain their trust. But, word of mouth, I've always been a grassroots person. I've gotten all my business over the years of grassroots. And people hear about me and pass my name along. "You need to call him. He does a great job." And I developed a name in the community. I went and spoke at a number of functions. People heard me, loved me, and believed in me.
Jason says Vernon Maxwell, Rick Jones, and George Visker were the first 3 ex-players to put their faith in him, and from there, slowly but surely, more players came on board. Meanwhile, he continued to work the phones with other law firms, seeking help with what was looking like a massive undertaking. It was difficult finding a firm willing to take on the NFL, but he eventually did. Russamano and Borello, a Miami practice that had had some success with medical malpractice litigation, including a case brought by receiver O.J. McDuffie against the Miami Dolphins. From there, they teamed up with Girardi and Keese, the Los Angeles firm that gained fame after winning a $333 million settlement from Pacific Gas and Electric for leaking chemicals into the groundwater in Hinckley, California. That became known as the Aaron Brockovich case and was immortalized in a movie starring Julia Roberts.
Filed the first 2 lawsuits ever, and everybody kind of followed our lead and started filing lawsuits and saying, they had clients too all around the country who had these problems and needed help and wanted to be part of this big mass litigation that I always thought was out there.
One thing that was interesting during this time as the lawsuit grew was how the NFL handled this annoying lawyer who was rounding up its former players for a lawsuit. Jason says the league didn't try to discredit him or question his credentials the way it did with his friend, Dr. Omalu, but there were other ways the NFL made it clear he had its attention.
I do believe that there have been overt attempts to silence me, and that's because they know that I'm a fighter and I'm not going to roll over, and I do believe that has happened many a times.
He mentions one incident in particular when he appeared on the show Morning Joe on MSNBC in 2015.
Were you surprised at the first low-ball offer the NFL made to settle this suit, given the billions and billions that league is worth?
After what I've been through for years of investigating this and standing by Dr. Omalu's side, I'm not surprised of anything the NFL does.
Why not?
Because, the NFL needs to protect its business. After all, we as a culture hold football higher than we do education. We hold football higher than we do politics. It is it is important as a society we hold it differently than everybody else.
The segment lasted about 5 minutes, but it would be Jason's first and last 5 minutes on the network.
As soon as I walked out of there, the NFL's offices called the president of MSNBC and said, "Don't ever have him on TV again."
That's what the MSNBC, like the producers, told you?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I know that happened with another network where they said if they played one of the interview that I did with another athlete, that they would pull their Super Bowl passes for the year. I know that.
But it didn't silence Jason, and it didn't stop the legal process from moving forward. Ultimately, 85 lawsuits involving more than 2,000 former NFL players were coalesced into one suit, which was moved to the U.S. District Court in Philadelphia. At that point, Jason and his cohorts lost any kind of leadership role in the case. It would ultimately be settled in 2016. Jason's feelings on the settlement are mixed. He believes it got too complicated, and there were too many loopholes baked into the results. He also would have liked to have seen the case reach the discovery process, so that the public could have seen more information on just how far the NFL went to hide how much they knew about the dangers of their sport. But ultimately, he's happy that the players have an opportunity to be compensated for some injuries they've endured, and that the work of Dr. Bennet Omalu was vindicated.
When I started this, it was, how do I show that Dr. Omalu's findings are for real and valid and scientific? And I didn't do this case for big money, and I didn't do this case for fame. I did this case for Dr. Omalu's findings, and I did this case because these players needed help. So if you look at what this settlement was, it vindicated Dr. Omalu because, after all, he got made into a movie. And it gave the players and their families an opportunity to get something that they otherwise would have never had. And those are two things that were very important. But the most important thing of all was why I did this case was to educate people of a risk that was inherent to the game of football, so that they can make an informed decision as to whether they want to play the game or not, so that the next generation of players wouldn't become some burden on our healthcare system, wouldn't become a burden on the taxpayers, wouldn't become a burden on Medicare, wouldn't become a burden on Medicaid. That in fact, that they should be taken care of by the leagues and by the teams through their own insurance policies on these poor guys. And with those three things being said, I think the settlement in the case was a success.
Moving forward, Jason says he'd just like to see greater transparency from the NFL. He said that all of this could have been avoided if the league had just acknowledged from the beginning the risks the players faced. The NFL could have put it right there in the contracts, like a waiver or an informed consent saying, "We'll pay you X amount of money and you assume X amount of risk for future brain injuries, including CTE." That would have been the end of it, he says, like the warning label on a carton of cigarettes or on a bottle of Advil. But he also understands why the NFL didn't do that and why they fought people like him and people like Bennet Omalu so hard. It's because, Jason says, the league knows that no matter what changes they make, it's always going to be an inherently dangerous sport.
You can make the game safer, but you can't protect a person from trauma in a contact collision sport. And I believe the NFL has done an outstanding job to try to make the game safer. But it's just imagining, what do you do to take trauma out of boxing? You don't hit each other. It's no longer a sport. Well, what do you do to take trauma out of football? I guess you do tag or flag football, and it's no longer a sport. So yeah, that's obvious why they would fight back. And again, this isn't a case about ending football. I grew up loving football. It has nothing to do about ending football. I did this. You have to understand, I'm not anti-football, and I hate when people say that we're on a crusade to end football. I've never once said anything about, well, a kid shouldn't play football until they're a certain age, this, that, all this other stuff. It's child abuse. I've never said anything like that. But I will say that I'm pro-athlete, because these athletes deserve protection. They deserve a voice behind them, and there should never be an organization or a corporation that should take advantage of any worker or employee and hide dangers to them, risks to them. So I see myself as a pro-athlete advocate.
Thanks for listening to the Raised Sports Podcast. For more on the story of the NFL concussion litigation, go to Raised Sports, where we have a post with the show notes from this episode, as well as some handy links for further reading on the topic. The show was written and produced by me, Bob Harkins. Music credits go to Lee Rosevere and Loyalty Freak Music, and the theme song comes from DL Sounds. Remember, we have a special this month only. Go to our show page at Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star rating and a brief review. Email us the screenshot and you'll be entered into a drawing for a Raised Sports t-shirt created exclusively for us by the great artists at Cool Fire Studios. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.